The night, along with the wind, cut right to the bone. The sky stubbornly kept covering itself with snow, and those little white flakes swirling in every direction filled the air with a kind of deathly silence. Lucas sat sunk into the chair by the stove, not even bothering to look out the window, just sitting there as he'd done for years, expecting nothing. The coffee in his old wooden mug had gone cold long ago. Next to him was a pistol, its trigger covered in dust, just like the last decision he'd ever made. This house wasn't just walls and a roof anymore. It felt like a tomb shaped by grief. Ever since he buried his wife Clara, he hadn't seen a single unfamiliar face. No letters, no voices. Just the wind. Just silence. And then a sound. It wasn't a knock, really more like a whisper. Thin, timid, and shy, a tap at the door. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But the second sound was even lonelier. Lucas slowly got up. His knees cracked as he stood, as if even the floorboards were trying to keep him from moving. When he opened the door, there was a figure covered in snow. A thin girl. She was wearing almost nothing, wrapped in a wet cardigan, her bare feet buried in the snow. Blood trickled down from her forehead. It hadn't frozen yet, still fresh. Her eyes were empty, but there was something there. Something deep. Lucas couldn't speak. The girl, as if she'd forgotten what words were, just collapsed where she stood. His hands moved on instinct. He caught her in midair. She was so light, like a frightened bird. He carried her inside, quietly. Didn't ask a single question. Just laid her down on the blanket in front of the fireplace. Clara's blanket. When he realized this detail, his hands trembled, but he didn't let go. Lucas didn't sleep at all that night. Even in her sleep, the girl's face twisted with pain. Her lips moved as if whispering something. Was it a nightmare? Or an echo from the past? Lucas thought about the way Clara looked before she died, how the light faded from her eyes, her last look. And for the first time, the emptiness inside him started to fill up. When morning came, the girl was still there, pale but breathing. Lucas quietly put together a plate stale bread, a few slices of cheese, an old piece of fruit. When the girl opened her eyes, she sat up suddenly. There was panic in her eyes, like she wanted to run. "It's okay," Lucas said, his voice almost as soft as the wind. "You're safe now." He didn't ask her name. He chose not to, because some names only leave scars, only open wounds. He just pointed at the food on the plate. After a long look, the girl slowly took it. A slice of apple. Maybe it was just a small gesture, but for Lucas, it felt like the first sign of life. They didn't talk at all that first day. The girl moved quietly around the house, didn't touch anything. She didn't even go near Clara's chair. But that night, when Lucas went out to chop wood and came back in, he saw her sitting at the edge of the chair, wrapped in the blanket, staring into the fire. But this time, she wasn't running. Lucas looked at Clara's photo. It was still above the fireplace. Her smiling face, caught barefoot in the grass. The girl's gaze was on it, too. Lucas slowly picked up the photo and put it in a drawer. He didn't say why, but something in the girl's eyes seemed to understand. It was a kind of permission, a kind of acceptance. And in that moment, the sound of loneliness changed. It was like the house wasn't just grieving anymore. On the second morning, the house was quiet again, but this kind of silence wasn't scary anymore. As Lucas lit the wood stove, the girl stood by the window, completely still. Her eyes were fixed on the snow-covered fence outside. Her hair was messy, and the old blanket draped over her shoulder still belonged to Clara. But this time, wrapping herself in it wasn't about honoring someone else's grief. It was like the shy first step of a new existence. Lucas took his coffee and went to the kitchen. For the first time in a long while, he felt something like living with someone again. They didn't talk, but this time, the girl's eyes followed his every move, as if she wanted to memorize everything, the place of every glass, the way the door creaked, which floorboards squeaked when you stepped on them. That second evening, the girl was sitting by the stove, cupping her hands around a mug. Lucas had made her some old tea with a bit of honey. She drank it carefully, but she was always on edge. Every noise made her jump. Her shoulders tensed up without her even noticing. This wasn't just ordinary shyness. Lucas understood that, because sometimes only a lonely man can sense the echoes in someone's past, even if no one else hears them. He wanted to try something. He quietly went to the kitchen and dropped a metal spoon behind him. The girl flinched suddenly. Her back tensed up, but then she quickly pulled herself together. She disappeared back into silence. That night, As Lucas sat by the stove, he spoke. "You hear it, don't you?" The girl froze. She didn't answer, but her hands gripped the mug a little tighter. Lucas was silent for a while, then continued in a softer voice. "You don't have to know. I won't tell anyone. Sometimes, silence isn't just silence." At that moment, between the crackles of the fire, he saw a very small movement. When he tilted his head, he saw the girl's thumb twitch, almost unnoticeably. It was like a yes, or maybe a maybe, and from that moment on, a new language was born inside the house. There was no need for words. The days started to chase each other. Now, the girl folded the blanket neatly every morning. She didn't leave the door ajar. She got water from the well herself, and before helping Lucas, she never asked for permission, but every move she made was gentle. To Lucas, there was no longer a ghost living in the house. There was a real presence, a real soul, quiet but solidly settling in. One evening, Lucas took an old notebook out of the kitchen drawer. It was leather-bound, with worn corners. There was also a piece of chalk. "This," he said, "belonged to my sister. She couldn't speak either, but my mom taught her words with signs. I remember some of them." He put 2 fingers to his lips and then pointed to the girl. "Thank you," he said, without words. The girl looked surprised, but a few seconds later, with a trembling hand, she did the same gesture. For a moment, Lucas felt a warmth inside. His eyes filled up. For the first time in that house, someone answered him. After that night, they worked together. Every evening, by the stove, they learned a few new signs. Cold, hungry, okay. Together, all of them sprouted, one by one, between those small fingers, right in front of Lucas's patient eyes. Now, silence wasn't just an empty space. It had become a bond. But that night, the wind changed again. Far off, he could hear the rumble of a storm. Lucas had gone to the barn to reinforce the doors, but something was eating at him. A feeling. When he got back home, there was no one inside. His heart suddenly tightened. He looked at the footprints. Small, bare footprints pressed into the snow. They led away from the house, beyond the fence. Lucas ran, without a coat or a hat. Snow whipped into his eyes, but he didn't stop. He saw a figure kneeling by the fence. It was the girl. Snow was falling on her, but underneath her, something was moving in the ground. When Lucas got closer, he saw what she was holding, a newborn, weak foal. It was shaking, about to die. The girl was shielding it with her own body. "What are you doing?" Lucas whispered in awe. The girl looked at him. Her eyes were full not of fear, but determination. She wasn't scared. She hadn't run. She'd stayed for the foal for life. Lucas picked up the foal in his arms. The girl kept her hand on his arm the whole way back. She fell twice, but she never let go. That night, they worked together in the barn. Lucas dried the foal. The girl brought straw, blankets, and warmed water. They didn't say a word. But that night, Lucas understood. The girl hadn't come to hide in this house. She was protecting it. And by dawn, the foal was alive. Its breathing was steady, its body warm in Lucas's arms. The girl was curled up in a corner of the barn, asleep on the straw. The blanket had slipped off her, but there was something on her face, a kind of trust, a sense of belonging. Lucas sat quietly. He clasped his hands on his knees. Then his eyes drifted not to the girl's sleeping body, but to a tiny movement her small hands made. She touched her chest with her palm. That meant home, and Lucas understood. This time, he wasn't alone. The morning came like a newborn hope. The wind had stopped howling, and even the footprints in the snow looked softer now. There was still warmth in the barn, not just from the stove, but from bringing a fragile foal back to life. Lucas got up early as usual, but this time, he wasn't alone. In the loft above the barn, there were traces of the girl's sleep, the shadow of a blanket, a body curled up in the straw, and that showed a new life that had quietly become part of the house. That morning, there were 2 cups on the kitchen table. The girl hadn't given any sign, but Lucas knew now that she would wake up. As he poured his own coffee, he poured boiling water into the other cup and sprinkled a little cinnamon in. He didn't hear her footsteps, but suddenly the girl slipped into the kitchen, as if she was just a part of the house. The marks of sleep were still on her face, but now there was a strange clarity in her eyes. She went to the sink, washed her hands, and without drying them, picked up the 2 cups. She set one for herself and one where Lucas was sitting. For the first time, without any sign, without a glance, she formed a sentence just by what she did. I'm here." Lucas didn't say a word. He just nodded a little in thanks. In that silence, there was a bond words could never carry. As the days went by, both of them started to change into something else. The girl no longer wandered around the house like a shadow, no longer acted like a guest paying respect to the spirit of the place. The table got wiped down. Blankets were folded, buckets left in the barn were filled with water. Lucas didn't say anything to her, but each new action seemed to awaken a long-forgotten memory somewhere in the house. One of those days, Lucas brought down a box from the attic. Inside were a few letters from Clara, a broken brooch, and an old piece of fabric, a small patched cloth Clara once used for her sewing. But something else came out of the box as well, a little notebook and a piece of charcoal. Lucas picked up the notebook and flipped through the pages. There were simple drawings in a child's handwriting, a hand, a heart, a flower, a house. Each page was like a world a child couldn't reach with words, but was still trying to tell. Lucas handed the notebook to the girl. "This belonged to Clara's sister," he said quietly. "She couldn't speak either, but her mother taught her like this." The girl looked at the notebook. She turned the pages. She paused at each symbol. Then, looking right into Lucas's eyes, she touched her fingertips to her lips and then turned her hand to him. "Thank you." But this time, she wasn't hesitant like before. Her hand didn't shake. She did it knowingly, purposefully. Lucas bowed his head slightly. He turned another page in the notebook. There was a simple drawing labeled home. The girl looked at that page, then lowered her head and touched her chest, as if to say, "My home." After that night, every evening, the notebook was opened. Instead of words, there were drawings, symbols, gestures. But what was told was more real. The girl still didn't speak, but now every movement was a word. When she wanted water, she pointed at the bucket, and when she needed help, she just slightly lifted her shoulder. And Lucas no longer had to try to understand her, he just listened. With his eyes, with silence, with patience. And while everything was quietly healing, rumors had started in the village. Because people are always curious about anything that stays quiet, and they're afraid of what they can't understand. A few people from town talked and speculated about the young girl staying with Lucas until they finally came to his house. But Lucas only answered their questions with one sentence. "She lives here now." Nothing more, nothing less. One day, they took the carriage out to pick up letters from the town. It was the girl's first trip. They didn't talk at all on the way. But every now and then, when her hair whipped across Lucas's face in the wind, that was enough to let him know she was there. When they arrived in town, the first thing they noticed was the way people looked at them. Whispering, half-said sentences, sarcastic smiles. They were all there. A man standing in front of the shop asked sharply, "Is this girl yours?" Lucas answered without even thinking, "She lives in my house. She'll be treated with respect." His voice wasn't angry, but it didn't back down either. At that moment, the girl's hand touched the edge of Lucas's arm. It wasn't a sign. It wasn't defense or gratitude either. It was a statement. "I'm with you." On the way back, they didn't talk, but their hands were no longer apart. The girl's hand was wrapped in Lucas's, not out of fear, but out of strength. The wind blew, the horse walked, the silence deepened all the way home. But now that silence wasn't empty, it was a bond. When they got home that evening, Lucas looked into the girl's eyes. Her face was muddy, her hands were cold, but there was warmth in her eyes. "They don't need to know who you are anymore," he said. "I know who you are." And in that moment, the girl made the sign for safe by joining her fingers. Then she put her hand on Lucas's chest, as if to say, "Here." And for the first time, Lucas realized he wasn't facing someone he had to protect, he was facing someone he was finally ready to walk beside. Time was no longer just something that passed, it was the silent witness to a transformation. Day by day, the house started to look like a real home again. Every morning, the light slipping through the window slowly brightened corners it once couldn't reach. The silence hanging on the walls wasn't from loneliness anymore, it was about two people listening to each other. And most importantly, that emptiness Lucas had felt burning inside for years had started to fade. Maybe for the first time, he loved something that grew in the quiet. Meaning, the girl was no longer just someone living in the house. She was someone who existed, who lived, who changed things. She cleared dry weeds in the yard, painted the boards on the porch. Lucas watched her every step, but he never stepped in. He just quietly accepted it. This girl wasn't just staying here anymore, she was fixing this place, just like she was fixing him inside. But peace could never last alone for long, especially if the town had a tongue. One evening, as the sun was setting, the sound of horses' hooves from far away shattered the silence of the farm. Lucas was sitting on the porch with a glass of water in his hand. As soon as he heard the sounds, the glass grew cold in his hands. The dust cloud on the horizon was familiar. People from town. For men. Familiar faces, but their eyes were strangers. The girl was inside. The door was ajar. Lucas stood up slowly without calling to the girl. He didn't reach for his belt. He didn't reach for his gun. Because today, the shape of the fight was different. The horses stopped at the door. The men got off silently. The one in front was young, a man whose face didn't show the wear of years. Maybe that's why he was so dangerous. "We heard," he said, his voice harsh like a stick scraping wood, "that you're sheltering a stranger in your home." Lucas looked at him, squinting. "Yeah, that's right. We heard that girl was sold. Her father got rid of her for a bottle of whiskey. So, what you brought under your roof is a shame." Those words were sharp enough to reach inside. The girl was still silent, but Lucas knew she was standing there, hearing every word. They were standing together now, not with words, but with silence. Lucas took a step forward. "Whoever breathes on this land belongs to this land. It's not about where you come from, it's about how you live here." The men frowned. Their hands drifted unconsciously to their belt buckles. What started with words could have ended in violence. But just then, the back door opened. The girl stepped out. She'd pulled her shawl over her shoulders, holding her head high. There was no fear in her eyes, just determination. When the men turned their eyes on her, she raised her hands without moving her lips. Fast, sharp signs. It was a language without words, but full of voice. "I didn't go. I didn't run. I chose." Without taking his eyes off her, Lucas went to her side. His face was steady, his stance firm. "This girl is going to live here," he said. "And no one is going to bring the choices made for her in the past into this place." The men's faces were stone, but one of them, the older one, lowered his head just a bit. Maybe he understood, or maybe he was just tired. After a short silence, they got back on their horses. They left without a word. But Lucas knew this might not be the last time they came. That night, there was a different kind of silence in the house. The silence that comes after danger, safe, but alert. Lucas dimmed the kitchen lamp. The girl was sitting by the stove, holding Clara's old mug in her hands. She wrapped her hands carefully around the cup, but wouldn't meet his eyes. Lucas came closer and sat across from her. He gently put his fingers on the table. "You surprised me," he whispered. The girl shook her head. She smiled for the first time. "Really? Not anymore," she meant. And that night, for the first time, a wound left over from Lucas's past didn't just close. It was covered with new skin, a new life, a new beginning. When the sun rose that morning, the sky was unusually clear. For the first time in a long while, the clouds had pulled back and light filled every corner of the farm. The ground by the fence was drying out. Even the boards on the porch creaked less. But for Lucas, the day wasn't defined by the weather, it was by the peace that came from the presence beside him. Because that morning, unlike the days before, the girl wasn't standing by the window, she sat at the breakfast table right next to him. Without hesitation, without asking. For a moment, while Lucas held his cup, he realized the girl wasn't like a shadow anymore. She was like a root. She had settled in, but not just into the house, into his life. They worked on the farm together during the day. While Lucas repaired the fences, the girl organized the straw in the barn. Words weren't needed anymore. A glance, a gesture, even just a posture. It was enough for them to understand each other. Everything was a dialogue built without talking. For Lucas, this was a miracle. He had learned to speak with silence. And, even stranger, for the first time, he actually loved this language. In the evening, as the sun was setting, the sky held both purple and gold at once. Lucas was feeding the foal in the barn when the girl came in. She wore an old but clean shawl, and in her hands was a carefully wrapped piece of cloth. At first, Lucas didn't understand, but when the girl opened what was inside, time seemed to stop. It was a piece of fabric, faded and worn at the edges, but filled with careful embroidery in the center. When Lucas took it in his hands, he saw small symbols, loops, river-like winding lines, marks stitched patiently by small hands. The girl looked at him, not saying a word, but her eyes said plenty. Lucas turned the fabric in his hands, tracing each stitch with his fingertips. Is this your story?" he asked quietly. The girl slowly lowered her head. That was a yes, but it was also a confession. This cloth was a past woven out of silence. Traces of pain, of survival, and of leaving things behind. Lucas set the fabric on the table. He didn't say a word. Because some stories don't need comments. Just witnessing is enough. I don't need to know everything, he said at last. But knowing you're here, and you're not alone anymore, is enough for me. The girl bowed her head a little. Then she did something she had never done before. She slowly reached out and placed her hand on top of Lucas's. Her fingers weren't warm, but the touch was deliberate, steady, calm. For a moment, Lucas's skin untouched by anyone for years felt like it belonged. That night, they sat together by the stove. They didn't tell stories, but the silence spoke in another way. The girl opened the old notebook, flipped through the pages. Then she turned to Lucas and made a slow, incomplete, but determined sign. I'm here. Lucas looked at her. Me too, he said. We're together now. The next morning, the farm woke up with a different rhythm. The girl changed the foal's water on the porch, made coffee for Lucas. There was no trace of the old shyness. Instead, there was a belonging that grew, step by step. In everything she did, the girl wasn't asking for permission anymore, she was just existing. But in the middle of this calm, the shadows from town had returned. This time it wasn't just 4 people. There were more. They stopped their horses at the edge of the farm. Their hands were close to their guns, and in their eyes there wasn't a look of confrontation, there was judgment. Lucas saw them through the window. He felt that familiar anger rising inside. But this time he knew he wasn't alone. He buttoned his shirt and went outside. The girl stood behind him at the door. Her eyes were calm but alert. The man in front didn't yell. He just spoke loudly. This land is ours, Lucas. Just like it used to be. We know who belongs here. Lucas put his hands in his pockets. This land can't be owned by anyone. Whoever's spirit is here, stays here. Someone in the back muttered, that girl. She's got darkness in her past. We know what her father sold her for. At that moment, the girl stepped forward. She raised her hands. And right in front of everyone, she made a few signs. Lucas translated them slowly. They didn't buy me. They left me alone. And I was born again. The men paused for a moment. This wasn't a defense. It was a challenge. Lucas added, without hardening his voice. Her past isn't here, her future is. And that future has no room for your prejudice. The silence stretched on. In the end, the men retreated. But this time not quietly ashamed. That night, by the fire, the girl took Lucas's wounded hand in hers. With her thumb, she traced that scar. Then she signed, I'm yours. Lucas didn't look away. No, he whispered. We belong to each other. And for the first time in that house, the urge to protect was replaced by something else, trust. As the morning sun touched the roof of the farm for the first time, Lucas sat quietly on the porch. He didn't have coffee in his hand, or a newspaper. Not even thoughts seemed to linger. There was only peace, a kind of silence that couldn't be described, but seeped into everything. But now, that silence wasn't the sound of loneliness. It was the sound of belonging. Because inside, in the kitchen, a girl had woken up. She was no longer just the girl. Not an unnamed guest, but a part of the house that had taken root, a silent melody woven into its rhythm. That day, they fixed the fences together. While Lucas hammered in nails, the girl carried the boards. The foal in the barn was slowly growing. In the corner of the yard, a small garden had been started. The girl measured the dampness of the earth with her hands, planting every seed with care. And Lucas, who once thought this farm would serve nothing but death, now watched life come back quietly, with awe. The gossip in town had faded. What started as resistance and whispers had now turned into surprised glances and then silent acceptance. Old neighbors started saying hello. A few people came by to help with jars of apple jam or old tools. Because eventually, people realized one thing. The girl hadn't run away. She hadn't hidden. She had simply stayed and built a life. One day, the girl handed Lucas a piece of paper. It was a pencil sketch, a distant line of mountains, grasslands waving in the wind, a house theirs. And in front of the house, 2 figures, one old, one young. But there were no faces, because words weren't needed. Only their presence mattered. Lucas stared at the drawing for a long time. Is this us? He asked. The girl bowed her head. Then she touched her chest, and then Lucas's hand. Home. That night, when they sat out on the porch, The stars in the sky didn't hang from emptiness, but from hope. Lucas looked at the girl sitting next to him. Her shoulders had dropped. Her eyes looked softer, her hands more confident. No one in this house had ever asked her name. But by now, she left a mark in every corner. The boards creaked under her feet, the cup she held stayed warm, and the blanket she wrapped around herself wasn't just Clara's anymore, it belonged to both of them. Suddenly, the foal neighed from afar. The sound didn't break the silence of the night, it just belonged to it. The girl lifted her head and smiled. And then, something happened that Lucas hadn't seen in years. For the first time, without being prompted, the girl took Lucas's hand. She placed her fingers between his calloused ones. The touch wasn't timid or forced. It was simply right. Lucas took a breath, a long, full breath. Then he slowly lifted that hand to his lips. "Now I understand," he said. "You didn't just give me a life, you gave me a journey. And in its quietest form, you taught me to be born again." The girl bowed her head. Her eyes filled with tears, but none fell. She just made another sign. She placed her palm over Lucas's heart, then over her own, as if to say, "My home is you." That night, while the stove crackled in the house, Lucas opened Clara's old notebook. He turned to the last page, and for the first time, he wrote something for himself, with his pen in trembling letters. When the girl came, there was a storm. Now there is no wind. There are only roots. This house isn't silent anymore. This house is us. The next morning, they brushed the foal's mane together. Then the girls signaled Lucas with a little whistling melody. At first, Lucas didn't recognize it, but then he remembered. It was the song Clara used to hum in the kitchen. The girl couldn't have heard it, but Lucas realized something. Maybe some melodies are passed down through silence. Maybe the girl had heard it, somehow from the heart. At the end of the day, as they walked through the garden, Lucas watched the girl's hair waving in the wind. There was no heaviness on her face anymore. This wasn't the face of someone who had been found on the road, it was the face of someone who belonged here. And at that moment, Lucas leaned down and whispered, "This is no longer just a farm. This is our home." The girl turned and looked at him. She didn't make any sign. She just smiled. Really, truly smiled. And that laugh was the most beautiful sound Lucas had heard in years.